So recently, there has been this increased interest and admiration that people have for a certain child. Now, this child came in unexpected ways. Many who were not familiar with the child started saying the name. Countless people, in fact, I would bet many of you in here, probably have a replica of this child in your home. The child was unlike any other, strong, mysterious, carrying power. Some wanted to kill him, others wanted to manipulate him for their own desires. The child I'm referring to is Baby Yoda. If you remember, Baby Yoda took the world by storm a few years back. If you don't know who that is, he's a character in a spin-off Star Wars movie. If you don't know what Star Wars is, it's time to leave the cave.
That's it.
But even if you don't know who he is, I guarantee you've seen him probably on the back of someone's Kia Soul. And it's interesting, though, how many of the great stories of our age. So you think about the types of stories that really capture our imagination, take the world by storm, whether it is The Mandalorian and Baby Yoda, whether it is Harry Potter, whether it's Frodo, you fill in the gap. It's kind of the same story. It's this one small, not seemingly significant character that will end up bringing redemption. And so this morning, what I want to do is I want to walk through a bit of the origin story of Jesus becoming human. But very specifically, what I want us to do is I want us to kind of peer behind the scene and look at the stage of Advent. To look at the God who stepped low, the God who stooped to meet us where we are at. So our teaching text this morning is going to be found in the book of Luke, chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. And it says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." And I love that Luke put in there, all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. She gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him in swaddling cloths, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. And so this starts with a census and going back home, and we find the town of Bethlehem. Now, Bethlehem was very small. Essentially, you could kind of think of it like a rural village. So today, if you were to take 441 and you're driving up to Gainesville, if you don't blink, towards your left, you're going to see a sign for a town called Reddick. That essentially is kind of the size of Bethlehem. It's just a few hundred people. The only economy they really had was agriculture. They had no political clout. Bethlehem had no strategic importance, but it did sit around 6 miles south of Jerusalem, which meant it's close enough to be kind of overshadowed, but it's far enough that it had no influence. So in an ancient world, when people thought about places of power, Bethlehem's not coming up. They're thinking about Rome. They're thinking about Alexandria. They're thinking about Antioch. They're thinking about Ephesus. No one is thinking about Bethlehem in any way. And while Bethlehem has no clout, has no relevance when Jesus comes, it is known for a very important and critical piece of history. Now, this is not history that would have mattered to Roman citizens, but it is history that mattered to the people of God. Because Bethlehem is the great Old Testament King David hometown. The one who slayed Goliath, the one who built kingdoms. Bethlehem was the very place that Samuel anointed David as king. It is the birthplace of Israel's golden age monarchy. A monarchy now forgotten. Power completely lost. And so Bethlehem now is just kind of this painful reminder of what was. One of the older prophets, Micah, in 5:2, he even mocks how small it is. He says, "But you, Bethlehem, though you are small among the clans of Judah, Then there's that next line. Out of you will come for me one who will be ruler. Here's the translation. Bethlehem, you're tiny, you're unimpressive, but God is about to flex his divine muscle on your behalf. And so even though it is under the oppressive regime of Rome, it still carries this messianic weight, this hope. And while the prophecy is tattered, it's faded, it's kind of forgotten, every Jew still knows the Messiah will come from that little town, Bethlehem. And this small town, while forgotten by everyone of importance, was not forgotten by God. It is the very place that Jesus would enter. And I think irony is the point here. That Jesus was not born in Rome, which would have represented power. He's not born in Jerusalem, which would have represented religious authority. He's born in a forgotten town that still held God's promise. And I think how appropriate that a nothing insignificant town becomes the birthplace of the king, deliberately chosen so no one will confuse who's writing this story. And so into Bethlehem, it really sort of sets the stage that all of the characters enter into. And when we talk about origin stories, most of the time in an origin story, one of the first characters we get introduced to is the father or the father figure. It's Uncle Owen in Star Wars, Mr. Miyagi in The Karate Kid, it's Uncle Phil in Fresh Prince, it's Mike Ditka in The 85 Bears. And in Jesus' story, we find Joseph. Now, Joseph, when you think about Joseph and you pass by some cute little nativity scene that a school did, right? Joseph is dressed up as a carpenter. There's just one tiny little problem with that. He wasn't really a carpenter. Not at least in the way that we think. We're told that Joseph was a tekton. And while we love that imagery that Jesus as a carpenter is making wood tables and someday he'll die on a wood cross, and that does preach really well, but it's not historically accurate. Joseph would have been a builder. He would have been a laborer in Galilee, and in this economic space, stones were far more common than any workable lumber. So realistically, Joseph was doing a lot of stonework. He would have been hired for construction projects, repairs. He would have been hired to work on different agricultural structures. And so this kind of puts him in the socioeconomical working class. So Joseph is not poor, as sometimes we make the image out to be. He's not elite. He's not middle class, because that category doesn't exist in the first century. And unfortunately, it's fading today. But Joseph was a manual laborer who lived off what his hands could do, whatever jobs he could get. So he's working class. He's not destitute. And we know he's not destitute because we see they're able to travel. They're able to pay taxes. Joseph is able to support a family. But on the other hand, they didn't live very comfortably either. Because as a tekton, he had a very unpredictable income. They're living in a harsh climate. He would have done a lot of seasonal work. Maybe own minimal land, but probably none. In today's vernacular, we would say they operated paycheck to paycheck. And we see this further illustrated when they go to the temple and they go to make a sacrifice, they offer 2 doves. And the reason they offer 2 doves is because they couldn't afford a lamb, and that was acceptable if you couldn't afford a lamb. So one kind of like common image you could say for Joseph is he's sort of like Jonathan Kent, who is Superman's dad. He's blue collar, he's unremarkable, easily overlooked in the social hierarchy. And Jesus, how appropriate, enters history when everything came from your father. Your namesake, your identity, your prestige, all came from him. But Joseph is not a priest, he's not a scribe, he's not a merchant, probably doesn't even own land. He's not a political figure. He has no clout. What he held was humility and love. Joseph was the type of person who would never be noticed. Religious elites wouldn't take him seriously. Rome would just see him as another cog in the laboring masses, the backbone of society that never actually took center stage. However, like Bethlehem, he did have one badge of honor, probably covered in dust, kind of seen as a relic of times past, but he was a descendant from David. And while that didn't bring him any wealth, privilege, or power, here's what it did mean, that Joseph still carried that messianic lineage, that he fulfilled Micah 5 and 2 Samuel 7, that he brought Jesus. He helped graft Jesus into David's family tree. And so a man, by society's standards, who's unimpressive, had the key that was holding the biblical narrative together. So Jesus isn't born into an aristocratic family, priestly family, or wealthy merchant household with influence. He's born into a blue-collar, working-class home, the kind of family that lived close to the margins, endured suffering, and knew the value of hard work, and that they had to trust their survivor, their creator, to survive. And it just shows that God is in the business of taking the ordinary and doing something extraordinary. Because what he saw in Joseph was the perfect man for the job. Which leads us to the manger. But to get to the manger, we need to talk about the census. Because the census is, I think, really the key to understanding the manger. Jesus is born during a census. Now, a Roman census, don't think about this like the guy who knocks on your door and you're not sure if he's a Jehovah's Witness or he just wants to know some basic details about you. That's not what their census was like. Their census was a reminder, a signal. You are conquered people, you pay tribute, you belong to Caesar. So into that humiliation, a baby is born whose title will also be Lord. So really, it's a political statement disguised as a birth announcement. And the manger in the first century wasn't the rustic decoration that you bought at Hobby Lobby last week. Now, you don't need to get rid of it. If it's still cute, it's fine, leave it up. But that's not really what the manger looks like. That actually comes from the Renaissance period. But a manger was either stone or carved wood, and it was primarily used as a feeding trough, usually fixed to the lower part of the house. And this would have been used for sheep, donkeys, or whatever animals that they kept, which means it's going to be filled with hay. It's going to be dirty. It's going to be a place of smells, moisture, bacteria. There's nothing soft or comforting about the manger. And that's about as far as you can get from a cradle. The most unroyal, ungentle birthplace imaginable. The polar opposite of royalty and prestige. But there's another angle that, in its time, probably would have been seen as more scandalous. Because being born in a manger is the polar opposite of the Jewish purity culture. Because anything associated with animals was seen as ritually unclean. So Jesus, his first resting place, isn't just humble and vulnerable, it is also religiously problematic. For Jesus, the Holy One, the Messiah, comes into the world touching what everyone else avoided. So why was Jesus laid in a manger? And Luke gives us the reason. There's no room in the guest space. So again, we go back to that census. Bethlehem is in census season, which means this small village of a few hundred residents would have swelled with travelers who were claiming the lineage from David. And in your typical first century home, you had a family room, which is where everyone lived, cooked, and slept. You had an upper guest room, which is where we get the idea of inn. When we say there was no room in the inn, there was no room in the upper guest room. And that was for relatives and travelers. But then you typically had a lower animal area back or in the bottom of the house, and you would bring the animals in on cold nights and also to protect them from predators. And so again, this wooden barn imagery that we have that looks nice and cute, we put a little light behind it, and for some reason Jesus always has rosy cheeks. That's just Renaissance art. They were painting what their world looked like, not the first century. The biblical story is just one of a simple, crowded house in a tiny village overflowing with travelers. And so the romanticized story of no room in the inn, it's not a hotel, this is a family home, there's just simply no space. So Mary and Joseph stayed in the lower level, and when the baby is born, the only place to put him is in a trough that is used for animals. And Luke is showing us something very, very significant here, because birth customs in the ancient world were incredibly symbolic. Your birth declared your social class before you ever spoke a word. Your birth set your position in life. A royal birth was in a palace with servants and midwives. An elite birth was in a private, clean quarters with midwives. An ordinary birth was at home with the village midwife. But then you had another kind of birth, which was birth of emergency, or we could say a more PG version, births of inconvenience, that simply happened wherever you could manage. So Jesus arrives at the bottom of the social ladder, because we were reminded in Luke that all of a sudden it's time, in a manger. And as far as we can tell from the text, doesn't seem to be any midwife, doesn't seem to be any extended family assistance. There's certainly no private room, no regular sleeping space. I think the manger, here's what it does. It shouts at us that the Messiah will not descend down through privilege. He will descend into poverty first. He will descend into the coldest, the darkest, the forgotten. Because Jesus is laid in a manger, God is reminding us there is no heart that is too dark or too dirty for him to enter in and rescue, because no one will be left outside of the grace of his Son. And the cultural significance is staggering, because the ancient Near East and Jewish culture as well, this was completely a culture of honor and shame. A king is expected to arrive in honor and not shame, and yet that's the paradox of the gospel, that our Christian story begins with a reversal. And then in the midst of this reversal, we get introduced to the first witnesses, shepherds. Now, shepherds were not the romanticized figures we imagine today as we watch Home Alone or whatever the movie, and they're all clean and put together. In the first century, shepherds were low-status laborers. They were culturally unreliable, in fact, so unreliable that rabbinic texts tell us they couldn't even testify in court. They were social outsiders. They lived on the margins. They slept outdoors under the stars. If Jesus had been born in a palace, shepherds would not have been allowed to cross the threshold. But a birth space reserved for animals, the baby lying in a trough, well, that was a scene shepherds knew really well. So Jesus being born in a manger, it becomes an open invitation to the least respected people, a statement that the Messiah will not be guarded by priests or elites and only accessible by a few, but everyone is allowed to cross the threshold. And so the manger isn't sentimental, it is humility, but it is also confrontational. Because the incarnation of Jesus, it begins in the least religious, least socially appropriate way possible. And it reveals a Messiah who chooses to embrace vulnerability, obscurity, enter poverty, and it becomes a foreshadowing of his entire ministry. Because he's the king who washes feet. He's the teacher who touches leopards. He's the Messiah who rides a borrowed donkey, and a savior who dies on a criminal cross. The manger is the first wooden object that holds his body. The cross will be the last. And let's not forget about Mary. Now, we often imagine Mary as like this serene 20-something woman in robes, but historically that's not even close. In the first century Jewish culture, girls typically were betrothed right after puberty. So marriage normally started between 13 to 15, and then for boys it was mid-teens, early 20s. And this was just simply how life was in an agrarian, survival-driven context. So when the scriptures introduce us to Mary, we're not meeting a grown woman, we're meeting a teenage girl from an obscure village, and Mary had zero social power. She couldn't own property, initiate legal action, testify in most courts, make independent social or economic decisions. Her entire life is defined by a male guardian, first her father and then eventually her husband. And so here, Jesus comes when women were deeply vulnerable within the structure of society. So when Gabriel appears and tells Mary she'll bear the Messiah, she's not making a free, empowered modern choice. Asking questions like, how does this change my life? How does this shape my future? No, she's making a choice from the most powerless point a person could hold in culture. Like, this wasn't about an option for her. It was the courage to say, I will probably lose everything. I have no safety net. I am fully dependent on God. And yet she still says yes. God didn't use a queen, a priest's daughter, or someone wealthy. He chose a teenage girl in a backwater town whose voice held no sway, whose name no one would recognize. And yet today, it's the most common name we know. That the most important role in history is given to someone whose entire worth in society's mind was secondhand. And I hope you see that God doesn't look for human strength to begin his work. He starts when human strength is completely absent. And so as we look at the narrative of Advent, we see the whole story. It is intentionally upside down. It's not by accident. It's not by misfortune or anything else. God is making his point super clear. And the challenge is, this was a point that Israel repeatedly missed time and time again, and we still miss today, that God does his greatest work where human greatness is absent. And I think what the nativity is meant to be is a wrecking ball that crushes to the ground every expectation of what a king, of what a Messiah is supposed to be. Because a king is supposed to be born in a palace, surrounded by luxury, protected by an army with ceremony. And yet the king of the universe, well, he's placed in a feeding trough. That the first throne Jesus sits on is a manger. And so the world expects a king to rise from power, but God gives us a king who begins in poverty. Now, if you and I, if we were working on a script with Spielberg for the Messiah's entrance, we'd want something gripping, maybe a priestly family of religious authority, but he's not sure if this is what he wants to pursue, or a wealthy family with social influence, but he feels like something's missing inside, but Jesus doesn't come that way, because that's not how God writes his stories. He chooses a teenage girl, a blue-collar construction worker, and a family that can't even afford a lamb at the temple. And for this long-awaited birth, this thousands of years waited birth, there's no private chamber, there's no doctor, there's no midwife, there's no living space, just a lower level with the animals, the noise, the dirt, the cold. Jesus enters into the world both literally and symbolically at the lowest point. That God chooses the place of uncleanness as a preview for the entire gospel. First witnesses are not royalty, they're shepherds, social outsiders, unreliable, ceremonial, unclean, rough, uneducated, and suspect. So I guess it's true what they say, that blessed are the poor in spirit, for they will see the kingdom of heaven. And while Jesus is a descendant of David, by the time we get to the first century, thousands of people were of David's lineage. This is no longer a line of priests. This is no longer a line of royalty or kings. This is a line of peasants, ordinary people. And I think what God is saying is, I'm going to hide my royal glory in the ordinary. And so Jesus doesn't begin among the religious, the educated, the wealthy, the powerful. He starts in an unimpressive nation, a village nobody respects, a family with no political influence, surrounded by people stuck at the bottom rung of the honor-shame ladder. And God looks down from his heavenly throne, and he casts the light of the world into the darkest corner of society. The Incarnation is God's central point. My power is made perfect in weakness. The last will be first, and the humble will be exalted. And so when we come to the story of Advent, what it's really about is the King of Kings stooping as low as he can possibly go to say there is no one who will be outside of the bounds of the saving grace of what I want to offer.